Well, here we go again. We're going to be talking a little bit about transmission dipsticks and the lack thereof. Actually, mostly about transmissions without dipsticks. Some of you guys are really familiar with this already because they've been around here for a long time. I just thought I'd run through this little presentation with you. You might notice that one of the significant differences between transmission oil and engine oil, besides all the other obvious differences, is that transmission oil tends to expand as it heats up. That's why on the transmission dipstick you'll have a cold range and a hot range. So if you happen to be checking the transmission while the fluid is cold, it's going to read lower on the stick than it is if you check it when it's warm. And it can be tricky sometimes if you're not really familiar with it, if you're not really careful, to get exactly the right amount of transmission fluid in there. And transmission fluid level is fairly critical. Too much transmission fluid and it can cause the fluid to whip into a foam and cause all kinds of issues, because you want to have fluid pressure that's not foamy, and because if it's foamy, obviously you can compress it, and you don't want to be able to compress fluid, and it's got to be able to do its work in a fully fluid state. People that in the military, because of the transmission fluid qualities of operating under high heat and still lubricating really well, they will take a squirt can with some transmission fluid in it and oil their machine gun, when it gets really, really hot, and it has a tendency to keep it from jamming and everything when you've been firing it a lot. I've never been a machine gunner, but a guy that I knew that was in the military told me they used transmission fluid for that. Frankly, some Marvel mystery oil would probably work better, but that's probably harder for them to come by when they're out there in a situation, especially in the field situation. Anyway, why in the world do you suppose they might have transmissions without dipsticks? One of the maybe they're shipped pre-filled. If you've ever bought a transmission from the from the OEM, or even from some of the remanufacturers, you might notice that some of them, not all of them, but some of them will come with transmission fluid already in them. This guy that I placed years and years ago, back in the mid-2000s at the Ford dealer over here, was talking about, well, let me back up. A different guy I placed at an independent shop, they got a transmission for a van, a Ford van, Windstar I think it was. And the guy, he swapped it out, the guy at the independent shop. But it came back a little bit later not shifted right, but it had come with the fluid in it. And so he called me and said, what should I do about this? I said, well, you bought it from Ford anyway, so send it to the Ford place and let them figure out why it's not shifted right, because it was remanufactured by the Ford folks. And so I called my guy over at the Ford place that drew the ticket, and I says, what did you find wrong with that transmission? He said they put the wrong fluid in it. And the way that he could tell was he could smell it, and he didn't smell the friction modifier in it, and it was supposed to have friction modifier in it. And so what they were feeling was the chattering of the torque converter or something. I don't know what they were feeling, but you know how the torque converter will chatter on a Crown Victoria. It feels like you're running over those little speed breakers coming to a stop sign. It'll go boom, 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 if the torque converter is chattering instead of slipping smoothly. And I think I had mentioned one time before how I had seen a Taurus that I had worked on that basically had picked up an engine surge, and whenever I was using the Service Bay Diagnostic System portable vehicle analyzer, I was looking at the torque converter. It was basically percentages of lockup, and when it was in its going up through its percentages, that's when I was feeling the surge. But when you would tap the brake, the surge would go away because it would drop the torque converter. Something I remember this, I've slept since then, a long time ago. But it turned out that this friction modifier that was supposed to be in the fluid had broken down or something. And so I just got some of that friction modifier that's supposed to go in the rear end on limited slip rear ends, and I poured a little of that in there and cleared it right up. And the people, of course, the transmission folks at Ford says, no, you should never do that. But then they started putting something that smelled exactly like the friction modifier in the fluid. So anyway, you can smell the fluid and tell it's got friction modifier. Some of them have got what they call lifetime transmission fluid. Mercedes likes to do this. And there was a 2004 Mercedes that my college president had bought his wife to drive, and he was talking about how it had lifetime transmission fluid in it and all that. And so they'd been driving it a couple of years, and one day he came in there and told me the transmission was acting funny. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, let's do. I mean, I know it's supposed to have lifetime fluid in it, but let's go ahead and just do a full fluid exchange, and then swap out the filter and put some more fluid in there to make sure we get it all. And so we did I had to create an adapter for that purpose, and we did a full fluid exchange on that Mercedes. He got me the right kind of fluid from Mercedes. He bought, a case of fluid from them. And whenever I swapped out the fluid, then that took care of the whole problem, and never had any more trouble with it. Also, I may have mentioned this before, there was a 05 Cadillac, one of them crossovers that came in there, a red one. And the lady said that the transmission was acting up. And I pulled the dipstick on that one, and whenever I got a look at the transmission fluid, it was sort of dark. It looked like brake fluid. It was a sort of a blackish, thin and blackish color. It had no red to it at all. And so I got the appropriate kind of transmission fluid for that one. And we did a full fluid exchange on that Cadillac and took care of that problem too. Of course, the way we would do it, we would, the fluid exchanger hooks up between the cooler lines and the radiator, and it's basically got a valve so that the fluid that's coming from the transmission cooler line, it thinks it's going to the radiator, but it's actually going into the dirty oil tank on the transmission flush machine. And while the transmission flush machine is putting the same amount of oil back out into the system, and after it takes more fluid to do this right than it holds. If it holds 13 quarts, you need to have about 17 or 18 quarts to do it. That can be fairly expensive, but the long and the short of it is, when you get through, we would take the pan off, clean, remove the filter, clean everything out, put the filter back on there, just like we were doing one of the old-fashioned transmission services, and then we would get the transmission all, with the new filter, new fluid, and everything like that. And it's surprising how many of those that fixed. There was another lady that came one time on a GM car. It was some small, I don't know, it might have been a Cutlass Oldsmobile or something, I can't remember. But she said it was cutting off when she stopped, and when I drove it, I could tell the torque converter was staying locked, and that was killing the engine. And so I checked the electrical part of it to see if there was maybe some shorts in the wire harness locking the converter when it wasn't supposed to be. And then I told her, I said, we're not studying transmissions this semester, so we can't go too deep into this thing. But let us go ahead and just do a transmission fluid service. At that time, we didn't have a full fluid exchange unit. And so we just took the pan off and got the fluid out of there and cleaned it up and everything. And I don't remember it looking all that bad. Put a new filter on it. And I put the transmission fluid back in there, filled it up. But I added a can of seafoam transmission tune. And she never had a problem with that thing again. She was happy as a lark. Sometimes it just, sometimes it's all it takes is new fluid. It's kind of like a Power Stroke diesel. Sometimes straightening out a problem Power Stroke diesel's got, it just needs an oil change. If somebody's gone too long without changing the oil. Prevent pollution from spills, whatever. They're kind of, who would come up with an idea like that, when basically you're going to be pouring all kinds of oil and power steering fluid in something anyway. That's not really a good, owners don't check fluids anyway. So a lot of the time, a lot of your customers don't ever check the transmission fluid. They just drive it. Technically, if it's not leaking, if you pull really hard, if you've got a hard working transmission that pulls trailers and stuff like that, that fluid, the state of that fluid will change to the point that it will become hot and sticky, and it will start putting varnish on the valves in the internal parts of the transmission, the valve body area and all that, and it will start causing it to do crazy shift things. My son, for a while, drove I bought this 86 model little Marquis, one of those with a little V6 in it. Had a C5 transmission in it, as I remember. When you were driving that thing down the road, it would start pushing fluid out the vent. This big clouds of fluid coming out behind the car, just making a mess all over everybody else's car. And on that particular one, I replaced it seemed like I may have installed an external transmission cooler, changed the fluid, and I replaced the modulator valve. And he never had any more trouble like that. But I think what was going on was there was enough crud in the radiator that was caked up around the transmission cooler that was in the radiator that it was basically, the transmission was overheating, and then it was pushing the fluid out the vent. Which it can do that if you overfill the transmission too. I don't know if you've seen that or not. Put too much transmission fluid in it, it'll push it out the vent and just make a mess all over the place. And on some of them Chevrolets, the vent would be in there where the pump is, and it would make you think the pump was weak. You wind up pulling it off when you don't need it. Fluid level's got to be exactly right. That is actually accurate, that the fluid level is critical on these automatic transmissions. You know, if it's got a little too much or not quite enough, you're going to have an issue with that. Well, if you're setting a transmission level, whether it's got a dipstick or whether it doesn't, the vehicle's got to be level. You get an accurate measurement of the transmission fluid. You can't have it setting crooked. Temperature of the fluid is critical because, as I said, transmission fluid expands when it warms up. If the fluid level is low, adding the correct fluid type in the correct amount is critical. And specialized tools like scan tools and special wrenches are a lot of the times required to do that. You need to be able to measure the transmission oil temperature with the TOT PID and the scan tool so that it can be in the right range, and your manual will tell you that. Now this is particularly critical in the transmissions that don't have dipsticks. And here's another thing. Whenever the engine is running and the transmission's not doing anything except just sitting there with the torque converter spinning, it takes it longer to heat up than it does whenever you're driving the car. So if you need to warm the transmission up and the transmission will pull, like if it's got fluid in it, it's not a bad idea to run the car down the road and back to warm the transmission up a little bit. This Cavalier is a 2002 Cavalier with a 4T40E transaxle. Now before I tell you about that, let me tell you, this one here, the fluid was easy to put in it because it has a cap on the top of the transmission right here where you pour the fluid in. But in order to see if the fluid if you got the right amount of fluid in it, there's a little hole. I'm going to show you that in a minute. But I wanted to tell you a story about this Cavalier that I've probably mentioned before. I don't know surely there's a bunch of you guys that hadn't heard this one. But this lady came and she said that she had been all over town in a neighboring town from where the college was, and she had had everybody that she could think of work on this car because it wouldn't go at about 40 miles an hour. And I drove it and it felt for all the world like the torque converter. The catalytic converter was clogged up. And so we came back to the shop and I ran through a lot of testing and all on the fuel system, the pressure, and mass airflow and all that hogwash. And I got to looking and I said, wait a minute, we're studying transmissions this time, and this is one of those transmissions without a dipstick, and the guys need to know how to replace how to check the transmission fluid anyway, so we're going to go ahead and check the transmission fluid. And so anyway, we met all these requirements. The fluid has to be at 104 degrees, engine's got to be running in park. You put a pan under the little plug area and then remove the plug. This is where the plug is on that. That's my hand, so you can see that's my thumb with a screwdriver. If the fluid doesn't come out when the plug's removed, you add fluid through the cap at the top, which is this one here, until the fluid runs out that hole, and then you let it stop running out the hole until it stabilizes right here. On this car that I'm talking about, we got it all ready to check the fluid, and I says, okay, we got to pull this plug out. When we pulled that plug out, there was about 1.5 quarts or 2 quarts of fluid that came pouring out of that hole until that fluid level got down to where it was supposed to be. We didn't add any fluid, somebody else had though. And a lot of times people have the idea, well, since you can pour some fluid in there, too much is better than not enough, so we'll just dump a bunch of fluid in it. So once we drained that fluid out, I said, I just wonder if that made any difference in the way this car ran. And when I drove down the road on it, it was just as smooth as silk. It had plenty of power. That's all it took to fix that car, was to put the fluid level where it's supposed to be. Now, this story gets better. Whenever my son married his wife, she was driving a 99 model Chevrolet car or GM car that had this same transmission in it. And he had worked at a tire store for several years. Then he went into the Navy for 10 years. Then he got out of the Navy and he went to work doing facilities maintenance at a manufacturing plant. That's where he's at now. But the point is, he took her car for a quick oil change to some oil change quickie place over there close to where he lives in Mississippi. And when he got it back, he called me and he says, all I had was the oil change in his car and it won't hardly run. He said, it's only got about, get about 40, 45 miles an hour out. And all I guess feel like something choking the engine now. And I said, well, take it to your shop. He had a nice little shop behind his house over there. And I said, raise it up, put it on jack stands, and make sure it's at operating temperature, the engine running in park. He pulled the plug out of that thing and about 1.5 or 2 quarts of fluid ran out of it. Just filled, pulled a bunch in a pan. And so then he put the plug back in there and tightened it up, and he drove it and it ran like a new car. And that was 2 times I know about that. Now, why this thing does that, I'm not sure, unless it's just choking down the converter, because the converter is supposed to do torque multiplication and fluid can't go anywhere. That might be the reason for it, but it has to be. But it wouldn't push it out the vent like it would on most other transmissions. Other transaxles, other transmissions will just push all kinds of fluid out the vent if you overfill it. But anyway, fill it with your screwdriver. It's supposed to be at the bottom of the check plug hole. But remember, the fluid must be at 104 degrees. Your transmission oil temperature pip will tell you that on your scan tool. Alright. Always fill and check on a Nissan CVT7 transmission. Located on the bottom of the pan, you got a 19 millimeter drain plug. Now this is looking up from the bottom. This pan's actually off the transmission. You notice that little Allen head? That's hollow. It runs all the way up. And I'll show you that from the inside in a minute. When you screw that off, this right here is a little stand pipe that's up in there. An internal tube with a hex head bolt. You screw that. You can screw that on out of there. Okay, this is what it looks like from the inside. This is like an overflow pipe, kind of like on your commode, If it gets above a certain level, it's supposed to overflow. This right here, whenever it gets above the overflow pipe with the fluid at the right temperature, it runs out and it drips out. When it stops dripping out, it's going to be right at the very top of that. And that's how that's supposed to work. The pipe can be removed. If you need to drain the fluid, you can take that pipe out and just use that, let that be your drain plug. Alright, so when you fill it back up, there's a charging pipe that screws into the check level overflow pipe area. In other words, you put this pipe back up in here, then you put this underneath it, and it's going to require you to pump fluid into the transmission from that location. So you're putting this back in there to pump it up in there, and really you put more in there than is supposed to be in there. You get the transmission at the right temperature. You got to let it run a while. You can't just assume. And then it'll start running out of there. When it runs out of there, it'll run a steady stream, and whenever it stops running, you can tell it's at the top of that standpipe, right? Now this right here is on some Fords and Lincolns. They're set up the same way. The transmission fluid, there's a little standpipe up in there. I'm going to show you how you do that right there. My Explorer, I got an 06 Explorer. It's set up like this. This is what it looks like under there. This right here, when you screw that out, you screw the whole thing out. But when you're going to put fluid in it, this is your little standpipe, and it's not nearly as tall as the one in that CVT, but you use that's going to be a T30 Torx that you can use to screw that out of there. So you screw that thing out of there. I will tell you this, if you're going to be doing a lot of this work, you might notice that these little things have got Loctite on them, and sometimes you absolutely cannot get them out. What I used to do, in my desk drawer, I had several replacement plugs that had these little things in them that I had bought from Ford, probably buy them from Amazon or somewhere now, I don't know. And I would keep a bunch of those in my desk drawer. We would try to take this out, hold that with a wrench. I think it's a 7/8 or 22 millimeter if you're left-handed. Try to screw that out of there. If it wouldn't come out, then I would just screw the whole thing out of there, and then we would replace that plug, and we would have a new one there that we could use. And then we would put a tool up in there, and basically you're going to use your scan tool to look at the transmission. You notice on this one it's got to be between 80 and 120. They're pretty forgiving. They don't tie it to one exact temperature. And so this is going to take a few minutes to warm it up to that. Of course, starting the engine, it's eventually going to heat because of the second law of thermodynamics. As the engine heats up, it's going to heat the transmission up, but it takes longer. than if you're driving the vehicle. Just keep that in mind. So you just need to be patient with this thing. And keep an eye on your transmission oil temperature with your scan tool. Move the shifter slowly through each gear. You gotta let it fill everything up in there and allow the transmission to engage or turn it to park with it running. Raise it up and set it as close to level as you can. Hold the larger drain plug with a wrench and remove the small center one. This is when you're checking fluid level. And that's where it is. And notice it's actually jacked up a little bit above the other part of the pan. This is a little fitting on that one. You screw in there after you take that other one out. Special tool that screws in where the center plug came out. We used one of these. It's like a grease gun, but it's made like a big syringe to move oil. And we used one of these for this. There's all kinds of stuff you can use to do this with. I mean, anybody, you can come up with any way you want to pump the oil, but it's got to be pumped up in there. You can't pour it up in there. You don't have to pump it in there with something. And you put that on there. They've actually got these tool numbers here you can look up if you want to. And we use that suction gun for that. That's OTC 2359. They sell them at the parts store, but some of the ones they sell at the parts store are kind of cheap and crummy if you don't buy a pretty good brand. OTC is a good brand, even though they don't guarantee nothing they sell. They make pretty good stuff. You got to check the fluid level. This is basically what's going on inside there, and it's going to be dripping out of there. But you're gonna put more in there than you need to, so that it'll be draining out real steady. And then when it comes down to the point of where it's supposed to be, at the top of that pipe with the temperature at the right, with the fluid at the right temperature, that's where you're wanting it to be. Volkswagens, a lot of your Volkswagens, your later model Volkswagens, have got a plastic stand pipe that screws up in there that's about that long. I had a picture. We took the one out of this one, and I had taken a picture of it. And I even posted it on my technical writer page somewhere, but I couldn't find it for love or money today. But I did find this picture of us using the suction gun, like I was talking about, to pump fluid back into the transaxle. And that was one of the things that you would do there. You know, a lot of these automatic transmissions, you don't even change the filter anymore. You just drain it out and change it and run it and drain it again and change it again, you know, by using a method like this. I mean, they won't even have a pan you can pull off. You know, some of the Asian cars and all that, but this one here worked like that, and that was, you know, pumping it up in there like that. On the Chrysler Mercedes stuff, you verify it's parked on a level surface. Remember, it's got to be level. And then you remove the dipstick tube cap, which is that one that says for dealer use only. It's got a dipstick tube, but no dipstick when you pull it off there. And, you know, sometimes they'll have a little thing that you got to take out of the way to get it off of there. You know what I'm talking about. Start the engine, let it run at idle speed in park, shift it through the mode several times with the engine stationary and idling. Warm the transmission up. You notice they don't give you a temperature here? At least 2 minutes, and check the oil level with the engine running. You got to push this long dipstick. It's a special dipstick that's longer than you need for the tube. And the way the dipstick tube is configured, it goes down into the transmission completely straight, so that the bottom of that pan is level underneath that dipstick tube. Mercedes and some of your Dodge Chargers have that. All right, so the dipstick contacts the oil pan and pull it out again. Read the oil level and repeat if necessary. This is what this thing looks like. Dorman sells a dipstick like that for like $12 or $15, I think, that you can get at the parts store. This is the transmission that we had in the shop over there that we had pulled out of a Dodge Charger. It was an 07 or 08 model or something like that. We had swapped it out. But anyway, that dipstick goes right down in there. You notice how it's going straight down toward the pan, and it goes out the bottom like that. And you're reading how many millimeters deep the fluid is. And there's a chart in the shop manual that you go by the temperature. See, they're going to give you a chart so that you can look at whatever temperature the fluid is on your scan tool, and however many millimeters deep it is. Your millimeters are over here, your temperature is here. So if it's at 160 degrees, it's supposed to be about 65 millimeters deep. That's pretty cool, really, for a couple of reasons. First off, you can get one of those dipsticks. You're going to need to know what the temperature of the transmission is, or you'll just be flying blind, so don't go there without having some way to read transmission fluid temperature. But anyway, you're going to use that right there. And you can find that There's probably copies of this online, or heck, you could freeze that one, but that one was for one particular transmission. It may be different from one transmission to the other, even the transmissions that are similar to this, so be aware of that. You can use a sensor port on some of them, and the sensor located in the common sump part of the transfer case above where the fuel level will be, its access hole can work well. Now, you can't just reach over here and find anything and everything that kind of looks like a fluid check place to pull it out of there. You know, that wasn't such a big deal on a rear end or a transfer case or something like that. But on these right here, sometimes you may screw something out that holds one side of a band, and then you've got big trouble because it pops loose on the inside. So don't just go recklessly go in there taking bolts out looking for which one is the drain. You need to do some research before you do that. But you know you're not going to hurt anything by pulling a sensor out, and you can put fluid in there if you need to. However, the level is going to have to be right. If you got one of those that's got the drain, the plug in the pan, you don't have to put it in from the bottom, you can pull a sensor out, put fluid in there, you know, with a crooked funnel, and keep on going until it drips out. And then when it stops dripping out, you're full. Of course, the fluid temperature's got to be right too. Now look at this one here. That looks like something where you would put fluid in it, doesn't it? On that one right there, that appears to be a fill plug on that CVT7 just above the pan. This is the one we were talking about earlier. The fluid level pipe is here, and the fluid level is supposed to be right there. I've actually got that line a little high. That's where that plug is. You can put enough fluid in there to get it where you can run it through the gears, but you cannot get it full by putting it in through that plug. Remember, that's the plug I'm talking about, and this is where the inside of that is. But see how much lower it is than the top of this? Well, you can't really go by that. You still got to top off the level. Now another example will be Toyota's U660E transmission, and I believe that's in the Highlanders and some of the pickups. Correct me if I'm wrong about that, but I believe that's where you'll find this one. This too has a drain plug and a check level pipe in the bottom of the pan, similar to the CVT7. This one right here, see, it's just a little pipe right there. You know, on some of these late model Ford pickups, they got a little tiny short dipstick tube in there, and a little bitty short dipstick. It's real aggravating to deal with because it's real hot when you're up in there. I should have showed you a picture of that, but I featured that on a previous one where we had to change the transmission control module. You know, they call it a lead frame. You know, you might remember me talking about that back then. About looking under the hood, you won't see a dipstick, but if you get under it, you'll know what it is you need to do. But anyway, that's one right there. You got to identify the fill plug. This one does have a designated fill plug above on the ear cover, and it has the letters WS on the plug, which identifies the type of transmission fluid it uses. And so you know that. You notice how similar that looks to this right here, you know. But anyway, that is a fill plug on that one right there. The long and the short of it is, you can't just fly in here and assume you know what you're doing when you're not sure, you know, where to put the fluid, how high it's supposed to be, how you're supposed to know when it's full, and that kind of a thing. Now, on this one here, on the Toyota, with the CVT7, a scan tool can be used to monitor transmission fluid temperature. This is really cool, though. You can get this tool here, and you can buy one of those online. They got a manual method. You jump the ALDL connector with a special service tool. Now you got to make sure that you're not going to spread those pins by shoving something else in there. That's one of the reasons this special tool is so important, is it just plugs right into there, into the TC and the CG ports and all that. So what does that do? Well, with the brakes applied, move the shift lever to the park to the S, and then slowly select each gear, S1 to S6, move the shift lever back to the P position. The shift position indicator D, if it's at the optimal temperature, it's off. If it's higher than the temperature should be, it's on. If it's lower, it's blinking. So if the transmission is cold, you're going to see the D light blinking. When the D light goes off with that little jumper in there, that means the transmission fluid is right where it needs to be for you to check the fluid level. And remember, that's just a quick way you can do it if you don't have a scan tool. You can improvise. You know, this was Wayne Colonna was talking about this. Some of these guys got this Honda power steering pump speed sensor assembly to be used to pump fluid. And basically you can spin that with a drill and it'll actually pump fluid. Now, if you want to take and move the fluid really fast, you know, without having to, you know, fool with suction gun or all that, dropping in there, any kind of a pump will work like that. You just got to be particular about the level, the temperature of the fluid, make sure that the vehicle is not sitting on an incline, and all that kind of thing. Improvise when necessary. There's one guy, Wayne said he visited a shop that had a pump and a motor on a cart with a car battery, and just whatever you can do that will work and won't be dangerous is a good plan. Well, I hope you got a little something out of this. This is not quite as long as some of the videos I've been making. I don't know, but what some of the videos I've been making may be too long. But I'll see if I can have something else for you to sink your teeth in next time. And we'll talk to you later.